The next paper is by Dr. Yektan Turkyilmaz. Yılmaz received his PhD from Duke University in the Department of Cultural Anthropology. He taught at Sabancı University and Bilgi universities, addressing the collective violence, memory making, and reconciliation. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Zentrum Moderner Orient in Berlin, Germany, and he is working on his book manuscript dissertation, Rethinking Genocide, Violence and Victimhood in Eastern Anatolia, 1913-1915, which concerns exactly the issue of the Armenian genocide. Yektan is known for having collected really all kinds of primary sources in many languages. I'm going to talk about rethinking the path to the Armenian genocide, June 1913, August 1914. Yektan, welcome. So yours.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So let me begin with a vignette. August 16, 1914. Only a few days after the outbreak of World War I, two prominent members of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Armengaro and Varkes, visited Kirkozora, a renowned Armenian intellectual and politician, at his rented house on Büyükada. These three notable Armenian political figures had also been members of the Ottoman Parliament after the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. That evening, they decided to write down their predictions for the war as kind of a stage parlor game. At the war's end, they agreed the losers would pay for a dinner party for the winner and 12 of his friends at Istanbul's famous Tokatyan Hotel. Here are the questions. In retrospect, these questions may seem horribly naive. Paradoxically, these three men had political interactions and personal friendships with the Young Turk leaders, who only months later would order and oversee their killings. As you can see, the parlor game questions clearly reflected how hazy and invisible were the horizons for the Armenian political leadership, the direction of broader international geopolitical prospects, their potential repercussions for domestic politics, and finally, the impact on the Ottoman Armenians, all were unknowns. Now let's look at their responses. I marked similar responses in same color. Ironically, the answers given by the three Armenian political leaders differed on all the questions except one. On question 8, all of them guessed that Armenians in the Ottoman Empire would politically benefit from the war. The question that incited the deepest anxiety and fear were the ones concerning the fate of Ottoman Armenians, more specifically, whether a new wave of Armenian massacres would follow. Varkes and Armengaro felt that a new wave of massacres was not possible. Zohrab thought that Armenians living near the border with Russia would seek refuge across the border, and there might only be partial massacres and lootings in other areas of Ottoman Empire. Zohrab won the bet posthumously, having foreseen the coming massacres, if not in their full scale and brutality. But he never enjoyed the dinner party prize, as among the three, only Garo survived the genocide. Armenian genocide is one of the most horrifying tragedies of the 20th century. And even a quick examination of the history of the Armenian question in the Ottoman Empire before 1915 documents a long and grave record of violence, widespread assaults, and appropriation of Armenian properties by the Kurds and other Muslim groups since 1860s. The Hamidian pogroms spread all over the Ottoman territories between 1894-96, and most recently, massacres in Adana in 1909. If one adds to this already gloomy picture an erratic ruling elite, which became increasingly radicalized and suspicious about the loyalty of its Christian subjects after the humiliating loss Balkan Wars of 1912-13, the path to genocide seemed not to demand any further explanation. Given such a telling record, how can we then make sense of the parallel game? Shall we assume that these most prominent Armenian politicians of the time, with personal connections to the young Turk leaders, naive? Or was the government's premeditation so secretive that they could not see what was about to happen? Or did World War I simply spark pre-existing and accumulating destructive energies? There is one tacit assumption that all these questions that are in fact reflective of existing threads of Armenian genocide historiography, share. There was already an escalating conflict regarding the Armenian question when the war began. This assumption fits within a larger tendency in genocide studies, what I call bias. That is, a tendency to focus on the factors that led to genocide over those against it. Whatever pertains to peace or the possibility of de-escalation, in other words, is often downplayed, ignored, or left unnoticed in the historical discourses produced around the genocide. Today, we speak about the eve of the genocide, that is the period between the Balkan Wars and argue that despite the widespread scholarly consensus, it was not characterized by a linear polarization or inevitable escalation. Many genocide scholars have demonstrated genocides are usually unpredictable events. Yet I deduce that the Armenian genocide is one of those few cases which was not only unpredictable, but was completely unexpected for the victims, who were caught entirely unprepared to the policies of extermination. But why is the escalation bias so seductive for genocide scholars in general, and in the Armenian case in particular? One cause of this bias is surely that to study genocide is to study hatred, dehumanization, violence, and destruction in its most severe, exceptional, and unthinkable form, and thus seems to demand the reassurance of explanation. Then too, genocide is a question of prediction, with cracking the codes of genocide so that we can predict and help design mechanisms to prevent it. The assumption overlooks the most salient qualities of genocide, namely, I quote, its contingency, unpredictability, and its status as a product of human agency, unquote. But I term escalation bias, on the other hand, enacts a teleology of genocide, which renders alternative scenarios impossible. It downplays political agency, reconstructing genocide as the inevitable outcome, and perhaps most importantly, it muddies the issue of responsibility. This form of explanation searches out aggressive discursive formulations and policy blueprints, and then uses them as evidence for veracity of escalation narrative, counting down toward its inevitable conclusion. Within this framework, I want to make three interrelated points to argue for and explain the unexpectedness of the Armenian genocide for the victims. First, that the post-Balkan Wars was a period when the Ottoman Armenian public opinion was, by and large, characterized by optimistic prospects. Second, I will suggest that political competition and contestation among the Armenian political elites, government, and European powers did not create a deadlock with a consequent aggressive polarization between the Ottoman state and the Armenian communities. I will do so by briefly discussing the Eastern Anatolian reform plan debates. Finally, I will turn to the on-the-ground situation in the Armenian provinces and show how emergent expectations of a Russian-sponsored Kurdish insurgency indeed created conditions of cooperation between the Ottoman state and Armenian community leaders. The parallel game that I opened my talk with illustrates prevalent optimism among the Armenian political elite in the capital. But let me try to make my point about optimism even bolder. In October 1914, 2 months after the above parallel game, a reception was held in honor of Tahsin Bey, the former governor, at the mansion of Set Kapamagyan in Van. In his memoirs, Terzibashyan, a prominent businessman, recounts that he delivered a speech to the guests consisted of Muslim and Armenian notables of the city, asserting the devotion of Armenians to the Ottoman homeland, toasted to the empire. Just as he finished, Ömer Naci Bey, part of CUP's core leadership, and a renowned young Turk agitator, whispered into Terzibashyan's ears, "You are fooling yourself." After stating the government's suspicions regarding the Armenian revolutionaries pro-Russian activities in the Caucasus, Ömer Naci went on to warn Terzibashyan. I quote, "We will participate in the war against the Entente powers. If Armenians support the Russians, we will massacre them. We will slaughter them ruthlessly, without remorse, without concern for the consequences. We will kill even the host of our table whose champagne we are drinking at the moment," unquote. Ömer Naci's words shocked Terzibashyan. The next morning, he hurried to Arshak Vramyan, the Dashnak deputy to the Ottoman parliament from Van, to inform him about the incident. When heard the story, Vramyan shrugged his shoulders and said, I quote, "He is crazy and a drunkard," unquote. Vramyan had been key figures in the Dashnak CUP negotiations regarding the war policies in August 1914 in Erzurum, and yet he too had no foreshadowing of what was to come. Like Vargas and Zohrab, Vramyan would also become an early high-profile victim of the genocide only 6 months after this exchange. Let me be clear here. These are not rare or outlying examples. On the contrary, these expressions reflected the general outlook. As Simon Vuratsian, an official Dashnak party historian, also retrospectively summarized, even with the outbreak of World War I, most believed, I quote, "In front of the Armenian people was rising unlimited and fascinating horizon," unquote. A very common presumed tipping point toward escalation in the current historiography is the Balkan Wars. For the proponents of the escalation approach, the humiliating defeat of the Ottoman Empire marked a watershed regarding the conflict in Eastern Anatolia. What followed is treated as a politics of confrontation, a process of escalation which continued until the genocide. This narrative underscores the ideological radicalization of Turkish nationalist thinkers after the tragedy of the Balkan Wars. Interrelatedly, it foregrounds the tensions for the creation of radically exclusionary economic and administrative Turkish measures by the central government. And finally, it focuses on the fear of disintegration among the CUP elite produced in the diplomatic dogfight generated by the Eastern Anatolian Reform Project, with the CUP coming to see Ottoman Armenians and their political organizations as agents of destruction. Let me be clear, I do not dispute that these conditions eventually contributed to making genocide possible. But my analysis goes further to ask, first, whether these dynamics had the same effect on the Armenian question or in eastern provinces as they did on other groups or geographical areas of the empire. And second, if the only consequence of the various changing developments in the Balkan Wars and afterwards was more conflict in the region. My research has led me to conclude that as far as the political debates and on-the-ground situation in Eastern Anatolian provinces are concerned, the period between June 1913 and August 1914 was, in fact, not one of escalating conflict. To be more precise, there was no indication of an aggression that emanated from source, steadily increased over time, or directed against one precisely targeted group. Crucially, in other words, the political configuration in this period still offered manifold choices for the actors involved. It was a moment not of foreordained tragedy, but rather uncertainties, contingencies that involved both centrifugal as well as centripetal at both inter and intracommunal scales. Further, in the eastern provinces, there were no sign of deterioration of intercommunal relations, general security, or the condition of Armenians. To the contrary, and ironically, there were signs of improvement as reflected in various episodes during the period. The post-Balkan Wars Ottoman state presented a weak, ailing, and at times easily provoked ideological and bureaucratic network. It resembles nothing as so much as a delicate chess game, where the Istanbul government did not have the resources and self-confidence to pursue a strategic or ideological line of action in Eastern Anatolia. Instead, with its limited resources and without the power of effective enforcement, the CUP government tried very cautiously to first prove to its public and to the international actors that it is still a viable sovereign state. Second, preclude any chaos in the eastern provinces that would lead to increased diplomatic pressure and perhaps Russian military intervention. And finally, to cultivate as much support as possible among the Armenians and Kurds alike in order to undermine any tendencies towards seeking cross-border alliances, especially with or within Russia. Another major piece of escalation argument is the Eastern Anatolian reform debates. The reform issue, indeed, by and large, reshaped and determined the terms of Eastern Anatolian question in the post-Balkan Wars period. On July 4, 1913, after extensive preparations, ambassadors of 6 great powers convened in Istanbul to discuss the Russian plan. A final draft was agreed upon after a harsh bargaining between Russian and German representatives on February 8, 1914, at Yeniköy, Istanbul. Why the Eastern Anatolian reform process did not lead to the presumed deadlock is that when the reform talks ended, as historian Roderick Davidson concluded many years ago, I quote, "there was no losers," unquote. Here, I do not want to go into the details of Yeniköy agreement due to time constraint, and Professor Zürcher already did that. But let me underline that it did not signal an absolute victory or defeat for any party leaving one side acutely bitter or angered. The table was still open for bargaining, contestation, as well as compromise. This situation is perhaps best illustrated in the February 27, 1914 dispatch of Armenian Patriarch Zaven to the eastern provinces. I quote, "This agreement, which contains only the fundamental points of the Armenian reforms, do not entire national demands. But we can also say that this is the first step. In spite of concurring that extreme enthusiasm is detrimental, it is necessary to fully comprehend and appreciate the real value of the acquired in order to utilize and realize it accordingly," unquote. Let me turn to the on-the-ground situation in eastern provinces and explain how, although invisible in the Armenian genocide historiography, emerging dynamics were also enabling increased collaboration between the Armenian political elites and the government against a third group, pro-Russian Kurds. In the post-Balkan Wars period, Tsarist Russia initiated a policy of supporting anti-government Kurdish movements in the Ottoman Empire as part of the endeavor to increase its influence in Eastern Anatolia. Notables such as Simko, Abdurazak Bedirkhan, Kör Hüseyin Pasha, and Selim Taha began to seek Russian support for their political agendas. At this historical conjuncture, that in addition to the Armenian question and Eastern question, a new axis of debate began to become visible, namely the Kurdish question. This situation created enormous anxiety in Istanbul, and it was also a major concern in British, German, and Armenian political circles. Hence, the specter of a wholesale and possibly cross-border Kurdish rebellion haunted their diplomatic communication and political strategies. Until World War I, nervousness regarding such a revolt marked the Kurdish threat as more immediate and urgent than an Armenian conspiracy for the Ottoman government. A key political consequence was to open up fresh discursive space for Armenian public figures to portray Armenians as the true Ottoman patriotic people of the eastern provinces against the Kurdish-Russian alliance. As the government's anxiety grew, and it began to take a more aggressive attitude against certain Kurdish tribes and notables, the Ottoman Armenian media celebrated the fact that eventually the government had come to see it as the perils of the politics of lenience against the Kurdish troublemakers in the East, unquote. In an article titled "Necessary Austerity," which appeared in the Istanbul-based liberal paper Byzantium on August 9, 1913, Byzant Keshian commented on an official press release that warned of a brewing Kurdish conspiracy. I quote, "The Kurdish newspapers, which have reported the Armenian newspapers, which have reported the Kurdish disturbances day by day, have the consciousness of having committed their patriotic duties. Our protest has been against the bloody bandit elements of the Kurds, who can also create immense perils for the state. These brigands, who have to be eradicated, are not ordinary bandits, but at the same time tools in the hands of the foreigners, i.e. Russians," unquote. At the time when the Western powers were debating the reform plan in the eastern provinces, news of violence and insecurity in the region would definitely strengthen Russia's hands. This concern, multiplied by the suspicion of a Russian-backed Kurdish insurgency, permitted the government to spread its fight against Kurdish opponents. The government press bureau frequently released news about arrest of Kurdish brigaders in Van, Bitlis, Dersim, and other areas. On September 14, 1913, less than 2 months after the above article was published, Byzantium's correspondent reported from Van. I quote, "The famous brigand Shakirov Krab and his guard has been killed. 2 of his sons have been wounded, and 4 or 5 guards were arrested with his son and his brother. This is serious news. Don't think that it is unbelievable. The news for the past 3 days a source of joyful excitement for the entire city of Van. Governor Tahsin Bey has proven his influence and saved the government's prestige. The Armenian committee is pleased by the determination he has demonstrated." Unquote. This feared Great Kurdish Rebellion was thought to have materialized in the spring of 1914. On April 1st, the Armenian papers in Istanbul announced Kurds of Bitlis and panic among the local Armenians. In the early days after the short-lived mutiny, the government, the Armenian and Turkish newspapers concurred that it was a movement against the reform plan. The Armenian language papers, Azadamart, Jamanak, and were pointing to a larger scheme or plot, which might even have had foreign fingerprints. Interestingly enough, the rebels, despite being believed to be religious zealots, were extremely meticulous about not attacking the non-Muslims on their way or in the city. It was reported that many Kurdish insurgents went to say farewell to their Armenian neighbors before leaving their villages to join the rebellion. Later it turned out that they had contacted the Armenian prelate and asked for Armenian support in the hope of creating a united front against the government. A high-ranking official told the editor of the Turkish daily, Tasvir-i Efkar, that 2 letters were dispatched by the masterminds of the revolt. One addressed to the Armenian prelate, full of assurances of goodwill toward Armenians, and the other letter addressed to the Ottoman governor, this one full of insults. Likewise, the Armenian prelate in Bitlis, Suren Kalemyan, wrote in a report addressed to the Armenian patriarch that despite his worries, the attitude of Kurds to the Armenians during the mutiny had been very positive. I mentioned the Kurdish rebellion in Bitlis because it once again suggested how contingent and fluid the relations among the government, Kurdish notables, and the Armenians in the area were. The governor Masar Bey was dismissed as soon as the Kurdish insurgents broke out. Once the newly appointed governor, Abdülhalik Renda, arrived, he did not hesitate to distribute 150 rifles and 10 bins of bullets to the Armenians so that they could defend themselves against the rebels. Let me say this once again. An Ottoman administrator was giving guns to Armenians only months before their execution began. This rebellion united public voices from diverse strata of Ottoman society around the display of support to the reform plan, which until recently had to heated debate and disagreement. For instance, even the pro-CUP daily, Tasvir-i Efkar, pointed out that the rebellion, of necessity for the reforms. Liberal Turkish daily, Peyam, extolled the Armenian loyalty and support to the government at such a time of crisis. I quote, "If there is any light in the midst of the darkness surrounding the same areas again, it is that this time we find our Armenian compatriots together with the enlightened minds stand on the side of the government. Now every who feels affection for his homeland should wish that the reform plan be implemented instantaneously." Unquote. Likewise, the French language pro-government Turkish paper, Jeune Turk, loyalty to the government during the insurrection and took the Armenians to have expressed, I quote, "their confidence about those who are at the head of the country's governance, since under the circumstances, only the current government can overcome the work of the renaissance of the country." Unquote. The pro-Dashnak paper Ashhadan in Van responded to the Jeune Turk. I quote, "The example of Bitlis is not the first and will not be the last, because Armenians, as it has been the case in the past, in the future too, will be in the first ranks among the nations constituting the empire in performing its patriotic responsibilities, if the chance." Unquote. These examples further evidence that regarding intercommunal relations and the security situation in eastern provinces, there was no deterioration. On the contrary, although written out of later scholarship, there were actually plenty of signs of improving relations between Armenian politicians and activists and their counterparts in the CUP government. This situation was repeatedly underlined by many first-hand witnesses in the region. In the introduction to his 1913-14 annual report, the American missionary Mr. Yarrow, in one, commented on the political situation and prospects. I quote, "It is with great, deep gratitude that we that much of the anxiety and apprehension mentioned in our last report has passed. Politically, the year has been filled with possibilities, and the fact that the present seems brighter than any year since the granting of the Constitution ought to encourage all those who are praying for the pacification and advancement of this troubled region," unquote. Likewise, Dr. Usher, in his 1914 report of one medical, the past year as a year full of blessings, perhaps the best year in our history. It's quite ironic and tragic that 100 years ago today, in 1915, same Dr. Usher witnessed Cevdet Bey give orders to Kasap battalion to exterminate all the Armenians of one, all the months after this report. On October 22nd, 1913, in the immediate aftermath of the killing of several infamous Kurdish brigands, daily Byzantium's correspondent observed that, I quote, "In the countryside, a very peaceful situation reigns. This situation has filled the inhabitants of the countryside with content, because such tranquility has not been witnessed in the last quarter century," unquote. What I tried to establish so far was that the Balkan Wars did not lead the actors involved in the conflict in and over Eastern Anatolia to a deadlock. Despite the prevalence of anxiety and ongoing competition and conflict, emerging intercommunal crises could, and in most cases, were overcome through compromise of the political elites. Community and political leaders compromised because they did not expect or predict an imminent catastrophic total collapse. Hence, coexistence continued to be the most viable option, and prominent figures such as Zohrab, Varkes, Vramian, and many others had solid reasons to be optimistic. This is not to say that the conflict ceases to exist, nor am I ignoring that ethnic or other forms of violence continue to be part of life, nor did the shadow of apprehension over everyday life stemming from communalist rivalries dissipate. Instead, I demonstrate that a precarious peace replaced the social and political situation of 1911, 1912. Therefore, I conclude that the end of the Balkan Wars and World War I was not a prelude to the Armenian genocide or to the overall catastrophe in the region. Myriad scenarios were possible. Unlike the Nazi Holocaust, the escalation in the Armenian genocide was not gradual, cumulative, but rather a quite explosive process. The genocide was only one, perhaps the least foreseeable, and its occurrence was not warranted by what happened in the aftermath of the Balkan Wars, but rather by political actors' decisions after World War I broke out. Decisions which were unprecedented, unforeseeable, and alas, catastrophic. But how then does all of this change or not the way we understand the Armenian genocide? As I conclude here, I leave this naughty question to our further discussion. Thank you very much.